Hello and welcome to History Hack. We've got a treat for you now. Much like hedge hopping last week with Matt Bone, we have decided once again to give you a new monthly show, not with Alina and I, but with two other experts in a particular field that is popular with our listeners, so that you can get a little bit more of a fix, if you like. And we've decided to go down the road of doing one sort of Napoleonic based. And to that end, welcome to the first edition of Sharpshooters with Zack and Marcus. Marcus is doing hand actions. Zack's doing a little footballer heart celebration. Guys, you excited?
Yes, thanks for having us. Looking forward to being monthly regulars. Obviously, Zack and I have already been on here, bashing Boney and down the pub, but now we get to properly geek off on our passions.
No, I'm really looking forward to this. So you're the first one you're going to do today, and I'm just going to hand over to you guys. You're going to tell us all about Wellington after Waterloo. Well, Marcus is going to tell us all about Wellington after Waterloo, and Zack's going to mitigate him from fanboying too much, aren't you, basically?
I feel this could be kind of a bad one to start with, because this could lead to the breakdown of the Cribb white bromance, because I'm much less impressed by Wellington after Waterloo. For me, Wellington in 1815 onwards is a bit like season 8 of Game of Thrones. You have that massive battle at Winterfell, and you're going, yeah, this is great. It's going right to the wire, all on a knife edge. And I won't spoil what happens for people. But then the second after that's done, everything just kind of goes a bit, what? And so there are some good moments. There are some moments where you go, oh, this is good. This is encouraging. Yeah, great job, Wellington. And then you have other moments where you're just going, what's he doing? Seriously, sort it out, mate.
That's an annoyingly good analogy.
I know. I thought you'd hate it.
Yeah, it does go down that route. I mean, yeah, it could be interesting. I call Zack my brother from another brigade commander. He calls me darling. So it could be quite interesting.
Only on Fridays.
Well, that's what you said last night. And it could be quite interesting because I don't think Wellington's perfect in this one, but I'm quick to come to his defence. It feels like almost part of the day job, so we're going to go into a bit of the day job on this with him going and living in London and his art collection. But also there's a lot of politics, and I know people go yawn, but honestly, politics in the 800s is so much better than politics today.
And it's something that we've completely neglected this period, sort of up to the beginning of Victoria's reign. We have bugger all on History Hack.
Yeah, so, I mean, we're going to do a duel today. We're going to do insults. We're going to do rights of individuals. Yeah, it should be quite good.
Brilliant.
Some affairs in there as well.
Yeah, everyone. God, you've got to have a bit of sex in there because it's history.
Sex.
You know what our listeners like.
Mobs, people literally throwing shit. Literally, not figuratively.
Cool. Right. Okay. Well, let's go. Tell us about Wellington after Waterloo.
Okay. So hopefully everyone does know the Duke of Wellington and the Battle of Waterloo, the 18th of June, 1815. It didn't even finish there. There was a little bit of fighting towards Paris, which was quite important. But we're going to skip to almost him coming back and the height of his fame and trying to find a good analogy for just how famous it made Wellington, not just in Britain, but across Europe. He would have been as recognisable when he's going around London. Population's about a third the size of now in the UK. As a member of the royal family, I'm talking not one of the obscure cousins, I'm talking Charles, the Queen, going around. His face was on everything. Today, people have tea towels and mugs with the Queen's face on it, especially around royal wedding times. But they put him on Toby jugs. They put him on pipes, cartoons everywhere in the press. They had silhouettes of him. People would have cameos made of him. And he was absolutely adored in 1850. This height of fame, it was somewhere between the Queen and Brad Pitt is the level that we're going for recognisability. It is absolutely huge. The government realised that Waterloo has finally brought the end to Bonaparte and Bonapartism. And love him or hate Bonaparte, I'm hugely biased. I loathe the individual. Zack's a little bit more towards the centre, but generally comes down on, there's about 5 to 7 million people died because of the war, so it's a bad thing. So we've got the end of that. It's going to bring around the stability of peace. And this is where the government vote to they vote an official vote of thanks, which is easily done, but then they start to vote like gifts individuals are gifting as well, but the government broke through. And one of the things they really want to do is build a Waterloo palace. So the best analogy for this is Blenheim. They really want something bigger than Blenheim. It's going to eclipse Blenheim, which was the Marlborough's victory at the Battle of Blenheim. So another duke. And they really want to make something bigger and better, but actually probably even closer to London. And they find a really good spot of land, short ride, about like 3 or 4 hours ride outside London, a place called Stratford-Say, North Hampshire. And they gift him the land. He gets the land, he gets a huge grant of money. And the idea is Wellington goes and sees it, but it's got a flat bit of land, there's a house already there, and then there's a river and a slow rise. And this would be perfect for a Blenheim-style palace where he can build onto that, looking over the rest of the scenery. And actually, Wellington realises that he doesn't need to do this. The house will be sufficient. So he's gifted this huge amount of land and money, and he spends it more wisely. He extends the house, modernises it, especially builds on new coaching houses. And then in 1816, in a closed letter bid, so it's basically his purchaser doesn't know who it's going to, he purchases Apsley House from his elder brother. So his elder brother doesn't know it's his younger brother buying it. It's Richard Wellesley at Apsley House, named after Baron Apsley, who originally lived there. And this is number 1 London, famously known as number 1 London at the end of Piccadilly. And this is where he purchases Apsley House. And he does kind of decide that he's been ambassador, he's going to be going to all sorts of things. He needs a London base, a London pad to kind of start his area of politics. And he does that. His initial offer is actually a bipartisan one. He's offered Master General of the Ordnance as a cabinet post, so it's quite different to now. They had lots of different positions for the armed forces within the cabinet. And his only agreement of accepting as Master General of the Ordnance is that he would not be a Tory member or hold the whip. And this is negotiated for quite a while, but they actually end up deciding, the Tory government at the time, that they would accept him basically as an independent. He's been made a peer, so he sits in the House of Lords, the upper house, and he will hold this cabinet position. And this is in 1818. And it does take these couple of years of purchasing the house. And he's going around Europe, basically schmoozing all of the aristocracy, the royalty, all of the leading generals. He actually meets some of his former enemies and starts to make peace with them, French generals and marshals. And he's made Master General of the Ordnance into the cabinet position, but with the understanding that he's not actually a Tory at this point. And very soon afterwards, he gets other positions, like Governor of Plymouth. And he gets amazing, amazing gifts. This is where Apsley House starts to come in. He modernises it, puts his first extension on, as a second extension much later, and he's filling it with art and making it a place to be. Some of the arts you can see there today, most of it, and this is where he's got things like this massive naked Napoleon in the entrance hall. You've both seen it, Alex and Zack have seen it. It's just 11 foot tall, naked Napoleon, and it was a gift from the Prince Regent. And they had to redesign the whole house around it. And this is brings us to 1819. So that's the beginning of him stepping into politics. About 3-4 years towards that kind of position.
I mean, a lot of that's fair. Certainly the celebrity thing. I mean, I don't think it's an exaggeration, although it's kind of out of the relevant periods to call Wellington a celebrity. He had that kind of status, on a par with Nelson, really. In fact, had he died at Waterloo, which was a possibility, there's a very famous incident where a cannonball comes careering across the battlefield towards the end of the fighting, takes off the Earl of Uxbridge's leg.
Or Copenhagen, his horse, could have kicked his block off.
Exactly. That could have very easily have hit Wellington instead of Uxbridge. Had he done a Nelson, in effect, and died at the moment of victory, to be honest, I think he'd have been elevated to a level beyond Nelson's following. Because he lived on, my argument would actually be that it did him some damage when it came to his political career, which we'll talk about later. And as a result of that, Wellington, ironically, although he had a very lengthy career as a kind of a statesman / politician / figure of influence, is less well known today than Nelson is. One thing that's important to mention is that between 1815 and 1818, Wellington's actually spending most, if not all, of his time in France, commanding an army of occupation of France, because although the French Bourbon monarchy was restored after Napoleon had been kicked out for the second time in 1815, there was a nervousness about what if he somehow comes back and does this again. We left it to the French to deal with their own affairs. Well, that didn't work. So why don't we have a coalition force? And this is kind of like, you know how people sometimes talk about, well, we have an EU army, or a bit like a kind of a NATO force. It's something along that vein, but a sort of 19th century equivalent, made up of British contingents, but also contingents from other nations. And Wellington spends his time being part diplomat, part commander. He's appointed head of that force, but he has to tread a very delicate line, because one of the things that you can always credit Wellington with is being very good at reconciliation with France in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. You know, he wasn't like some of the other commanders out for vengeance. If you look at what Blucher wanted to do in the wake of the victory at Mont Saint-Jean on the 18th of June, what he wanted to do was tear the French countryside apart and loot and pillage and plunder. Wellington turned around and said, no, that's not on. That's not good, because he was thinking ahead. So he has that forward-thinking attitude. And yeah, as I say, and as you said, you know, he spends that time forging connections with other statesmen, leaders, emperors, etc., and is very good at that. I think by that point, he's probably thinking about the future and thinking politically, and starting to work out, how do I forge the connections to really pursue a career? But he was in Parliament before the Peninsular War. You know, he was an MP, spoke briefly, and then went out to serve. So he's always kind of had, Rory Muir puts this really nicely, he's always had that kind of head on his shoulders where he's thinking simultaneously about politics and patronage and army progression, and all of these things are interlinked in his head.
Okay, so this is the era, and we really famously get onto the St. Petersfield massacre, Peterloo, but there's a lot more to it. So Britain's been through 20 years of war, whether it was our fault or Napoleon's is hotly discussed between historians. I come down on the thing that it doesn't really matter who declares war. Physically, we declared war on Germany in 1939. We weren't the aggressors. But that's just my opinion. We've been through 20 years of war. It is starting to bankrupt the country almost. We've brought in, under Pitt the Younger, this is going back to almost the beginning stages of the war, a very unpopular thing called income tax. Can you imagine such a thing? This was a brand new idea, just to raise armies and fund overseas expeditions to fight Napoleon. And it was hugely unpopular. I thought it was really kind of hitting at the middle classes. And income tax was thought to be temporary for the war only, and has unfortunately continued. And that's why we lose so much of our income each month. It's all down to Napoleon. But there's a lot more. People are sick and tired of war. You can think that the younger generation have been born into this era of war and have grown up and seen so many of their families die and been wounded. Both what we don't see is also, like, we see the physical examples, but the mental kind of anguish, especially those who've served, whether they've been, having what we now know as PTSD, shell shock, and all the scars mentally of war, or just physically having been in the armed forces, which is a really oppressive institution at the time, really, or just serving overseas for such a long period as well. That comes in alongside that there is slow want of reform that's been simmering for a long time, and that has been oppressed by subsequent governments of both Whigs and Tories, so Liberals and Conservatives, but they're known as Whigs and Tories back then. They're not necessarily the same parties we have today. And there's been this call of agitators and pamphleteers, and this is the way that the working classes operate. They have very good orators, great speakers, who will stand up in areas basically on a soapbox and call towards the crowd. And they start to organise. They realise that if more people come, then they've got more power. And they hand out pamphlets, like little slips of paper calling for what they want, like a bullet points memorandum of reforms. representation in Parliament is one of the big things they're going for. They're going for universal suffrage, some of them for women as well, which is very forward-thinking, even within the rest of Europe. And some are going far more radical. Some are calling for direct representation within the government, removing layers of government. Some are calling for removal of the monarchy, and everything in between, including full revolution. This is where we get the real difficulties of machine breakers. This is kind of a revolution where people are seeing their jobs go out of work because they're being replaced by industrial machines. And so they're physically breaking them, the Luddites, and there's a whole subsector to that counter-revolution of industry versus employment. And this is all a big maelstrom. And it culminates with the North especially feeling very disenfranchised with Parliament. And they start to massively organise and march. And what happens at St. Peter's Fields is not the first. It happened in 1816, 17, and 18 as well. But at St. Peter's Field, it's hotly contested. They did do a couple of days of drill before they went into Manchester, and that really worried the locals, the local magistrates, because they think that basically military action at the time is a form of drill. If you can stand to attention and stand at ease and march, it's not far off doing loading the firing with a musket. I know for myself, it's basically like a drill movement. How to load and fire black powder weapons. It's very regimented. And then there is the awful thing of you having a rater in a packed area, a lot of agitation, magistrates who are scared, and they bring in, because we don't have a police force, they bring in the army. And this is just a powder keg, where the army, especially the local yeomanry, who've got a vested interest in supporting the industry, putting down anything, they just go hot-headed and in. And this is the St. Peter's Field massacre. Not a huge amount of death, though some really unfortunate, basically murders. But what it does cause is a huge want to cause extra reform, so there's not more death. You know, British soldiers killing unarmed British civilians in Manchester is just not what anyone wanted, either the reformers or the politicians. And this is quite unfortunate. There's then 6 bills passed to suppress more reform. And Wellington does support these. He's in government in a military post, and he does support these. And this is hugely unpopular. But their reaction to the clamour for reform is to suppress reform. And one of the really interesting ones, I think, is the Cato Street conspiracy that comes up. So groups start to gather, and some of them are calling for softer reform and voting rights, and some of them are radicals. And at Cato Street, which is just outside modern-day Marble Arch wasn't there, it was Tyburn, a famous hanging spot. Marble Arch was then the front gate of Buckingham Palace, if no one realised. It was moved by Queen Victoria. And in that area, it was quite down in our area, but you're not very far from Parliament and government. They agreed a plan where they were going to storm a dinner that the cabinet were going to be held. They were going to storm into this building. They were going to kill everyone they saw, and they did right, basically, that they were going to be footmen meeting them and porters and unarmed innocents, and they would kill them too. Just storm into this building. The dinner was being held on the first floor. They were going to kill them all, and then one of them, who was a butcher, said he was going to start severing. I think he named 3 heads, and he was going to sever their heads off and take them down to London Bridge and try to display them as traitors. And in that, Wellington is named as not one of the 3 to be butchered like that, but to be killed. And all the cabinet were going to be killed, some decapitated, including the Duke. Then there's one of their numbers, actually, he's a constable. Peters will come on to. He's a constable, really early form. I think the Bow Street Runners. He's undercover, and he gives them an address and a time that isn't actually going to be any cabinet meeting, and he helps arm them. So there's an element of entrapment, and everyone goes along with it. Everyone goes, we're going to go and kill all the government. The undercover constable, he reports them to the Bow Street Runners. They're stormed by lots of constables, and there's a shootout in the top floor of this kind of like coaching barn in London, Cato Street. And there's a shootout. One of the constables killed. Nearly all the conspirators are arrested. I think 1 or 2 managed to jump through a hatch on the floor and run. And they're tried. A few turn on each other, and they're allowed, basically deportation to Australia. but then most of them are at Tyburn, and actually then they're beheaded, and so they're displayed as traitors to government. That's how extreme it's getting in 1820. To give politics a bit of context, that we've got massacres in Manchester, and we've got conspirators in London who are planning to kill the government, and are some are shot and killed, and others are executed as a result. So, a height of tension at the time.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots there, isn't there? I love that you're blaming Napoleon for income tax. That's that's a new one on me. 20% of my income gets taken away from me directly because of Napoleon. So a nice little bit of money bashing there. I think it's important to acknowledge at this point that, you know, we're dealing with a guy who was a snob here. Wellington was unashamedly aristocratic in his outlook, and that's to be expected. You know, he was from kind of medium level aristocratic background. Okay, it was an Irish peerage, so that was valued as less than he comes from a family with an Irish peerage, so that's viewed as kind of being inferior to a peerage in England. But he has those aristocratic values. You know, he famously, quite unhelpfully actually, calls his men the scum of the earth, for a wide variety of reasons, some of them related to discipline. But he repeats that comment on a few occasions, and what he's effectively saying is that these people are coming from the dregs of society. And the fact that he's referring to them as scum because they're essentially working class tells you a lot about his attitudes. And as you kind of touched upon, the reason that these people are orating in St. Peter's Field is because they don't have any other form of expression. You know, we're dealing here with a society where wealth dictated the right to vote. And yes, you may well turn around and say, oh yes, but that was typical across Europe, which is completely true. But there is a genuine fear of the working class. And I think Wellington kind of feels that fear himself. You know, he didn't support, and we'll talk about this more, the expansion of the vote. He had that fear about the impact that that would have. There's also a fear about the fact that actually, because there was conscription to the militia during the Napoleonic Wars, the potential for the working class to rise up much more effectively than it might otherwise have been able to do is also very real. And I think that has a factor to play in. We haven't got on to talk about rotten boroughs yet, but they're another massive issue that is really significant here. Not only do you have a lack of widespread suffrage, and suffrage being dictated by wealth, you also have a situation where people don't have any form of representation, full stop. You've got cities with populations of millions who have no representatives, and yet you have rural regions that send 2 MPs to Parliament because of the need to completely redraw the constituency maps.
I think Manchester was one of those that had either none or just one member of Parliament. And then one of the ones down where I grew up in Dorset, now Weymouth, then Melcombe Regis, had actually 4 MPs it was sending to Parliament just because of some outdated rules. And yeah, it's so much to unpack with the politics of the era, but
It's
definitely
just reminds me of
boroughs.
that episode of Blackadder, the third, where he runs for Parliament.
I think it's really accurate for what
that's the thing, because it's a send-up, but it's actually what was happening.
You can pick up the voters, and you can buy the land. I mean, I think there's a whole thing there with like the voter actually is Derek the dog or something. But no, you can definitely buy the land. And Old Sarum was the famous one, now the beautiful castle. And the land was so valuable because it would grant you the right voting rights. And basically, there's only like 10 voters. So if you could buy that land, it would guarantee you like 10% of the votes, and people would try to buy 2 or 3 of these plots of land. And the land was then worth 10 times what it should have been worth for grazing land. So there's a whole thing of fraud here. Votes weren't secret, which had the opposite effect of that you would know not just who you're voting for, but your rivals, and people would turn out to see the votes cast. And lots of people turning out wouldn't be voters; they wouldn't have the right to vote. And they would try to put pressure on other people. So this is where the working class, they can throw things at people if they vote against someone that they don't want. And there's all sorts of lists I've seen of people throwing like dead animals and rotten vegetables. I think like a dead dog and cat was thrown at a voter once and things because they weren't voting how the crowd wanted. And it's this agitation of mob that it's really interesting to see it from both sides. And obviously, voting reform and universal suffrage is so important to our culture and society. But at the time, we kind of got to see it with the correct lenses. It is scary. What happened in the French Revolution, it wasn't just, oh, they'll execute the aristocrats, it doesn't affect me. It went way beyond that, during the terror. And people were just being executed for having relations with aristocrats, or they thought they were then a Jacobite supporter or even sympathizer, or they didn't write something in the press. And there was this genuine fear. I think Master Commander quotes it, do you want to see a guillotine in Piccadilly? No. And this is what they're trying to keep out. And it's this knee-jerk overreaction of then trying to suppress genuine positive reform. And Wellington's caught in the middle that he's not a very good political operator in the UK. And he's had most of his political experience, which has been really good, is in Spain and Portugal, where he's been working with the ambassadors, one of them happens to be his brother. And he's very good at trying to motivate everyone to a common cause, which is to win the war. And now the war is over, we've got basically a general who's trying to fight a new war, but not understand the battleground.
Yeah, I mean, you're quite right. We do need to be careful about how we kind of view this, because the context does matter. And yes, particularly with the legacy of the French Revolution being so fresh in the minds of leaders, that certainly contributes to this knee-jerk reaction. But at the same time, just as we endeavour to be kind of a bit balanced when we talk about Napoleon and say, well, look, there is some good as well as there is some bad when it comes to Wellington. At the same time, this is not a guy who supports kind of egalitarianism. I mean, there's a debate to what extent does he support egalitarianism even within the army. Certainly, Wellington preferred ability with a title to somebody's name over somebody who just had plain ability. And that's a view that's kind of been endorsed by a few historians. But yeah, I mean, there is a lot of corruption in the system, as you kind of say, and it runs much deeper, where you have people who are renting land, or whether they have a premises that's owned by somebody who's aligned to a particular individual. What you will see is that these people are prevailed upon to vote a certain way. So the corruption runs incredibly deep in the system. It's not really that surprising that in the wake of a conflict where everybody's played their part to a large degree, you have people kind of going, well, we spent all of this time fighting somebody like Napoleon, who did, admittedly, it was a corrupt political system under Napoleon. Votes were rigged, and I'm always quite kind of forthright in pointing that out. But Napoleon did have a system of much more widespread suffrage, albeit, I would say, to a large extent, kind of a sham democracy. So it's not unreasonable that these people turned around and went, you know what, this sucks. And it's a dark stain on a few people's reputation that they responded in the way that they did to this and just suppressed rather than listened.
Yeah, I mean, it's really good points. Napoleon's held up, and it's a huge debate that we have. Is it a kind of democracy? I know I'm biased. That's not surprised, but I say it's not. He's casting people's vote for them. The frustration of people wanting to have their own votes, and then having someone like Wellington block it. And Wellington's been a member of Parliament, actually, in a separate Parliament in Wales. I was wrong, sorry, separate Parliament in Ireland. And as well as now being a peer. So he's elevated. Only his brother should be in hereditary peer, but all of a sudden, because of his military acts, he's sitting in the House of Lords and the cabinet. And so they're seeing someone who's them. He shared the hardships of campaign. Wellington didn't go around with a palace, basically a mobile palace like Napoleon did, following him. But now he's back and he's acting like you'd expect aristocrats to act, and it's basically disappointing. He is a Tory with a big T, he's a Conservative with a big C. He's acting in the interest of the nation. But the best I can do to kind of show balance is that we have to be wary of the government probably would allow a small amount of reform, But what they don't want is this huge clamour for like revolution and agitation, and they're trying to suppress that, and they're doing basically too much suppression for anyone's good. But the reason being is the fear underneath. And it does bring us on to another period of change. It brings us on to George IV. George III dies in this period, and George IV comes in. It was a hugely controversial but fascinating figure. Bars his own wife from the coronation, even though she turns on.
The horror, Marcus, an absolute horror.
He's absolutely terrible, and he's actually not someone that Wellington's personally fond with, but he basically has to look after him. He's put as Lord High Constable of England, which is one of the great officers of state. I think it's like right there in the top 5. Mm-hmm. And he oversees, basically his job's to oversee the coronation, and he's looking after him. And after this, kind of a really good example of their relationship is that George IV is asked to tour the battlefield of Waterloo and kind of demands, he doesn't really ask, Wellington to be like a tour guide. So you've got battlefield tour guides. Wellington is basically one. And Wellington's there reminiscing about the battle, where he stood, where he fought and won it. And remember, Wellington cried at the end of Waterloo. He was deeply, deeply moved by this. And apparently, like, George was just like, yeah, cool. Really, really casual, really cold towards the whole thing. He didn't get the sacrifice of the people, the conflict on both sides, except when he takes them back into the town of Waterloo. So the battlefield is actually at Mont-Saint-Jean, which is a much smaller like hamlet, ridge. Waterloo is a couple of miles to the north. When he takes them there, there's a really strange bit where there's Uxbridge's leg. So the Earl of Uxbridge, as he was during the battlefield, then the Marquis of Anglesey, he lost his leg. Zack mentioned earlier, there's this cannonball rips past both of them. The French didn't have shrapnel, so it's a bit of like cannonball casing comes off and it rips all over the place. And it could have killed Wellington, definitely. There's another couple of examples I'm thinking of. But this rips past both of them and rips off nearly all of Uxbridge's leg, with a bit left like hanging. And it's later amputated at Mont-Saint-Jean farm. And they bury it not far from Wellington's headquarters. They tell this story to George IV, and this is when he starts to like weep and get really emotional, like quote some poetry probably. It's just really strange how he seems to be affected by Uxbridge, who Wellington's actually quite distrusting of, because he ran away with his sister-in-law at the time, and they became friends later. But Wellington at the time didn't really like Uxbridge that much. It was a functioning relationship. But George IV was like breaking down, going, "Oh, what great sacrifice, England," and things, and doesn't get about the 50,000 men that died. That doesn't really seem to affect him. But one of the aristocrats is injured. That sets him off. So it's a really difficult time for Wellington's now got George IV, and he's then hosting him in London. He's having to work with him. He's gone from regent to king, and they do have private dinners together. But I can't find anything that makes me think that Wellington actually liked George IV. In fact, some of the sources are saying that he wasn't fond of him at all, but it was a sense of duty that he had to work with the king. This is the Parliament run quite differently, and the monarch's got a lot more say than now.
So, Marcus, obviously we're leading up to, aren't we, his time as Prime Minister. How is it a surprise that he ended up as Prime Minister, or is it a natural progression?
Yeah, it's really strange. There's a whole load of strife in Parliament. Castlereagh, who's one of the great ministers, he actually commits suicide. I think he slashes his own throat. And Lord Liverpool dies. And so Canning forms a coalition, and that's going on, and it starts to break down. And that's more of a kind of a coalition mostly led by the Whigs. And this is where it all breaks down, and it becomes almost inevitable that they're going, Wellington's in government. Wellington's now becoming this great statesman. It's 1828, and he's there, and he has expressed he doesn't really want to be Prime Minister, but he agrees to it kind of under protest. And one of the big concessions he makes is that it's going to be led from him as Prime Minister in the upper house, the House of Lords, it's the senior house, still is today. But his second in command is going to be Robert Peel. And Robert Peel is going to basically lead from the Commons as Home Secretary. And this is great. I really like the pairing. So Wellington's requested directly by the King, and it's much more informal than today, where it's a formal invitation. The King's actually like George IV is like kind of almost begging Wellington, going, "There's no other man for the job. It's got to be you." We don't have it in the House of Commons to have just Peel by himself. We need the Lords, as they're far more Tories. And so Wellington reluctantly agrees, sees this inevitability. But what he does is he agrees with Robert Peel that if he's in, we can start to make reforms. And it's under this ministry, it's known as like often a Wellington-Peel ministry, that we get a really famous series of reforms that I think are great. Not only do they reduce capital punishments, and a lot of things that were formerly executions are changed to being the exiles to the colonies, especially Australia, which sounds really bad and obviously does have potential for losing life, but we're seeing a lot less than executions in London especially, which is a step in the right direction at least. But it's under this that Wellington allows and encourages, I think, Peel to form the first metropolitan. And under this, we get 1,000 constables, full-time employed. And this is when they're known as bobbies, or Robert Peel, or peelers for, Peel. And they're really unpopular at first because it's seen as like maybe probably being going to be used as a form of oppression. But actually they're not. They are there, like on the beat, to be used to try to solve crimes. Before, like the Bow Street runners would charge people, and constables were individually hired by different boroughs, and it was really complicated. The peelers, as they were, had 1,000 of them set up, and they could cover a lot of London. They were given some really basic equipment, I think, like basically a truncheon, some uniform, and often a pistol, because weapons were much more freely available in Britain then. And they start to crack down on crime, and actually they're there for really honourable purposes. And it's under Wellington's prime ministership that this happens. And I think it's a really forgotten part of Wellington's time that he really does help Peel get this through. Then we get into a really murky area of Catholic emancipation.
I've got to pick you up on some of that, though, Marcus. I'd agree with what you said earlier about how Wellington is always motivated by a sense of duty. That's, kind of what underpins his relationship to an extent with a number of his monarchs, although with Victoria, he actually likes Victoria. They have a much better relationship. With George IV, I think we can probably see the duty thing coming in there. As a person of his reputation, it's his duty, particularly as somebody who holds the King's Commission, to do as the King bids. And with the coming PM thing, I certainly think duty played a part in there. With the capital punishment thing, though, and Robert Peel and all those reforms, I'm going to go kind of full history nerd on you for this. The capital punishment thing, the reduction of the capital punishments, this is something that has a much, much longer run-in time than just Wellington. And I wouldn't actually say that Wellington deserves much of the credit at all. The credit here goes to Peel, who'd been pushing for this for a very long time. Part of the reason that they start ditching what's known as the Bloody Code, which is this 200-something stipulations of crimes that incur capital punishment, is because what you see happening at a grassroots level is that courts aren't enforcing it. And the punishments are so severe that quite often people are less inclined to prosecute in the first place because they don't want to see these people being executed for the fact that they've stolen a certain amount of goods. And so people will very deliberately say that what they've had stolen is just under the threshold for capital punishment. And even you see this in proceedings from trials, even when people actively ask, look, but are you sure that this didn't actually amount to more than what you're claiming? They turn around and say, no, absolutely not. Equally, some people don't prosecute because of the expense. So there's all kinds of things going on there because you have to pay for the whole process of prosecution. It costs you time. You have to gather in the witnesses. You have to see to their accommodation. It's not anything like what we have today. So there are a lot of reasons why legal reform happens, not least the fact that people aren't implementing capital punishments because, thinking has moved on and they're not keen to kind of constantly be stringing people up for things like theft. When it comes to the Metropolitan Police, again, there's a long run in for this. Peel had been doing this kind of thing in Ireland from as early as 1812, I think it was, and he forged a number of his plans for the Met Police on the force that had been brought in Ireland to kind of keep law and order. And he tried to bring this in on a few occasions. There are a number of committees that meet from the mid 1810s onwards that are looking at this question of introducing a police. And there's a lot of resistance initially. It's only when Peel is able to demonstrate a sense of rising crime. There's a debate to what extent did Peel's reforms actually just make crime more visible, or was there actually an increase in crime? But through a sequence of reforms, Peel was able to build a case by saying, look, we've got crime stats going up. There is clearly a need for a force. As you say, there are efforts made to kind of make it non-military. The officers could carry pistols, but the standard, so we're talking kind of detectives and so on, could carry pistols, but the average constable was deliberately dressed in black because it wasn't the classic red. The truncheon, occasionally they could carry swords, but that was quite rarely done. And yes, it was a significant reform, but I really don't think this is Wellington who's at the helm here. This is Peel doing what he's been trying to do for a long, long time. And there's no kind of discussion about what the army did, because bear in mind, the army has its own police force. Initially, you've got the Provost and you've got Staff Corps of Cavalry, and in time they kind of merge into just the Provost. The Staff Corps of Cavalry has its own kind of ways of working. There's no evidence that I've been able to find of Wellington and Peel having conversations about the two. In either direction, Wellington not drawing on Peel's ideas, and no real sense that I've been able to find, and perhaps I've just missed it, that Peel is drawing on Wellington. So I have to disagree with you there. I'm sorry, mate.
I think it's fair to disagree. It's definitely your area. It's the fact that it's happening at all by Peel is because it's under the guise of Wellington, and he basically allows it to happen. It's this umbrella of Wellington going, you carry on, Robert, if you want to get these reforms through under my parliament, as long as I've got your support, you carry on. And I think that's just generally a step in a positive direction.
Fight, 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 fight.
Yeah, do you know what? I'm going to come back. You're egging me on. I'm going to come straight back on this. You're going to love this. Yes, you're right. Wellington doesn't get in the way, which is fair enough. But I mean, again, I come back to my research and I look a lot at reform of military law specifically, but also of wider kind of legal punishments and stuff. And what you really notice about this is that the reforms are not driven by any means by government agenda. They're done on a very ad hoc basis. I mean, the example that I've been writing about very recently is about military law reform. And actually what you see is lots of individuals just kind of sticking their heads above the parapet on a particular occasion and going, I would like to see this happen. Sometimes it gets passed, sometimes it doesn't. And this isn't government agenda pushing this forwards. At no point does there seem to be any sense that Wellington turns around and says, right, we're all going to sit down and have a conversation about how do we really improve the system. It's Peel who drives this. Yes, Wellington doesn't get in the way, but I think all the credit goes to Peel because it strikes me as being a bit like Wilberforce, kind of chipping away at this problem for a long time with slavery, and with time, eventually he's able to secure success. But I don't see this as being Wellington. Sorry, bud.
Fair enough. One thing that is definitely Wellington's going to be the power behind is Catholic emancipation. And this is a really divisive topic at the time and really complicated today. So Catholics have basically been second-class citizens ever since, in simplistic terms, the gunpowder plot. And they had so many rights taken away from them about what land they're allowed to own and if they're allowed to be politicians and offices they can hold and jobs they can do. And Wellington is, I believe, the driving force behind changing this. Not only did he grow up in Ireland, he's got friends from the aristocracy who are Catholic, but he's also, I think, it's probably there that he is recognising of how many of the Irish Catholics were in his army in the Peninsular War especially. And between the three, his upbringing, the army and his friends, he decides that the thing he wants to achieve in Parliament is to emancipate the Catholics, to give them rights. And he pushes it through, and it's amazing. You think, well, we're just discriminating against people based on their religion. Well, you'd never do that today. These are, British. These are British Christians. No, this was still a huge topic. It had a big effect upon loads of different areas, including education, and Wellington being like the head of Imperial College London, and it was so hotly debated in Parliament. The Earl of Winchelsea, he calls Wellington basically a papist. He said there's cartoons of this. They've got these fantastic cartoons of the era showing Wellington kissing at the Pope's feet, which is trying to show that Wellington might be giving more affection to the Pope than to the King. So he didn't really like the King, but he certainly wasn't Catholic himself. And that's kind of the hint they're trying to give, and that he might be disloyal to Britain. And it's really complicated, but Winchelsea insults him so much that Wellington calls him up for a duel over it. They don't just spar verbally anymore. They agree that it's been such an insult from Winchelsea that it's going to be a duel. And they agree. They establish seconds, and they go forwards. That they agree that it's actually on the 23rd of March, 1829, that they're going to meet on basically Battersea Fields, now near the power station, just off the park. It was then Fields, and they're going to meet out there. And there's loads of debate about this, whether Wellington had agreed beforehand what was going to happen, but there's quite a few sources say that Wellington had actually thought that he was going to shoot wide on purpose. And Winchelsea, they both turn up, and remember, this is like the honour code. It's the field of honour, just turn up, not basically chicken out. So they both turn up early in the morning. Dueling is illegal, and Winchelsea fires straight up into the air, so it's really clear that he's not going to shoot. He shoots first. Wellington is basically mulled it over, and for all intents and purposes, he shoots to the side, wide. There's one source that says it like almost shot the buttons off the back of his coat, but Wellington's probably not a good shot. He almost certainly is not intending to shoot and kill him. But this is the last case we've got of a prime minister fighting a duel, and certainly one fighting a duel whilst he is in the office, very office of prime minister. And I just think it's really interesting to think that, less than 200 years ago, what would happen then if it was transposed to today, and our prime minister for today.
Yeah, the duel is just a farce, isn't it? I mean, it's almost sort of hilarious in terms of the whole thing. I mean, as you say, Wellington was a pathetic shot. I think he even acknowledged that himself. So even if he had aimed to kill, which is, as you say, open to debate, I'm not sure he would have hit anyway. The interesting thing about the Winchelsea side of things is that Winchelsea's second only agreed to act as a second if Winchelsea very clearly did not fire on the Duke. So such was Wellington's reputation that he wasn't actually in any danger there. But, they still had to kind of turn up and satisfy honour as it was perceived back then. But with the duel, I do feel Wellington's an absolute hypocrite here, because duelling was very common during this period, probably becomes less so by the time that Winchelsea and Wellington are doing it. But Wellington's an officer in the British Army, and as a commander out in the Iberian Peninsula, he was losing his rag over officers conducting duels for obvious reasons. He didn't need his officers killing each other. He had enough problems with the French killing his officers. So he, lambasted people and signed off on their dismissal from the army, casheerings, on the basis that they had fought duels. And his orders are kind of full of, kind of laying into people for this idea that dueling will be acceptable. And what does he go and do? He goes and does exactly the same thing. So it's another one of those moments where I do think it's not his finest hour.
I think Wellington is quite hypocritical at times. He's trying to balance military orders and being prime minister, to summarise his first meeting, he issues the cabinet some orders. Effectively, he sits down with these people and he thinks of it as like a war cabinet. He tells them, right, this is what we're going to do. And I think the quote basically summarises that then they all ask questions. And he was completely taken aback that he didn't know, well, why are you questioning me? I'm prime minister, I'm the boss, and thinking of it, still being a general. And that's not the case. Politicians want to question everything and debate it. And he's really struggling to balance the two. And it comes down, like you said, to honour. It's very hypocritical. It's probably one of the reasons why it's the last time it's done. But I think it's a fascinating one that a sitting prime minister has decided they've been so insulted. They're not going to go to the papers. They're not going to insult them back. They're going to try to duel it out. I think both are intending to fire wide, but and so it's all very outdated kind of concepts, social construct, that they're going to both turn up and intend to not do anything to hurt the other. I mean, can you imagine if Winchelsea had intended to hurt not only the Prime Minister, but the Duke of Wellington, this famous individual? It would have been beyond average. So Wellington manages to push it through. Peel guides it through the House of Commons. Wellington pushes it through the House of Lords. And there's actually a lot of Tories who vehemently oppose emancipation, and the bill only passes with Whig support, so it's a bit of a coalition. George IV basically hints that he's not going to give it royal assent. It wouldn't be quite the constitutional crisis that we'd have today, but it would have been outstanding shock in society.
It would have been taking us back 200. The last time a royal refused assent is 1707, I think.
Yeah, so it would have been like 120 years rather than now where we're pushing towards like 200.
Yeah, but it'd be going back to sort of the kind of premise of monarchy of Charles I. So like,
it is
200 years for him to think he had a right.
I've got a right of Charles to do this, and this is where we don't really have a stable monarch from George IV. He's all over the place.
Yeah,
and he certainly basically throws his toys out the pram. He has this long meeting with Wellington. He goes, I'm not going to give this royal assent. And Wellington decides that this is going to be, the hill that he dies on, thinking of Mont Saint Jean now. He stands there and he stands up for the Catholic Emancipation Act. Whether we can argue whether it's for his own face or whether it's for the good of the nation.
Or just the principle of the fact that George IV has absolutely no right as a constitution.
No right to do it. And he stood there as the monarch and said Wellington's very respectful and he feels it's a right duty to serve your monarch. But he doesn't take it. And he threatens to resign. And he says that if he resigns now, you're probably not going to have anyone else who's going to be able to form a government from either the Tories or the Whigs. And you're just going to be left with absolute anarchy inside Parliament. And eventually, after a really long meeting, it goes through. This gives Catholics the basic rights that they've never had as individuals since the Stuarts. Really basic human rights. And it allows people who have freedom of religion today that kind of franchise. However, it does have a negative side to it. It doubles the threshold for the right to vote, which used to be a rental value in your house of 10 shillings. It's now 20 per annum. 20 to 40 per annum. And this overthrows future reforms. This was really unpopular, and it sets up the basis for reform. Public are demanding it now. They've seen the Catholics being emancipated. They've seen that lots of people actually lost the vote as well as gaining it. And there are now going to be riots in London about the Catholic emancipation. It's really amazing to think that the great British public, many who don't have the right to vote, start to riot in London because Catholics, just based upon their religion, are now gaining rights to vote or rights of office. And so Wellington, I feel, is like a kind of good guy here. On the whole, he's trying to stand up for the Catholics. It is really, really unpopular in London. Buildings are heavily damaged, and they have to send in the cavalry, basically, because the police force aren't big enough. And the police force form rings around palaces, especially St James's Palace, where the king is, to stop this. The people are clamouring for what will become the Great Reform Act and much wider suffrage. Wellington refuses. He's basically being told now actually by the king and by every MP going that he's going to have to do it. And he refuses. He is at heart, a traditional Tory. He does not want to see this. He's slightly scared of it. He thinks it goes too far. He thinks it goes too quickly, and he loses a vote of confidence. And he loses basically the power of government, and the Whigs do come in, stopping Wellington's time. The riots don't stop there. Wellington's unpopularity is now height. So a man who only about 15 years before was the height of fame, honour, I'd say celebrity, and just absolutely adored, is now so unpopular. He's seen as betraying the British people, and this is where his carriage is attacked in London. The children especially throw horse shit, dog shit in the streets at his carriage, and bricks are thrown through the windows at both Downing Street and up at Apsley House. At the time, you could basically walk down Downing Street, and the windows are all damaged. People just try to throw things through all the windows. And this is where he puts iron shutters on his windows. These protect, especially along the ground floor of Apsley House, to try to protect the whole property. In fact, the mobs get so bad that the butler at the time runs the roof and has to fire his blunderbuss from the roof to disperse the crowd. It really scares everybody away. But the iron shutters go up, and it was from there we get the nickname, the Iron Duke. It's not to do with his military reputation, all the stuff that Zack spends his time brilliantly researching about discipline. It actually comes from iron shutters on Apsley House, and this is where we get the Iron Duke from.
Can I take you back to the Great Reform Act for a second? Because I'm going to put another Game of Thrones analogy in here, because I agree with you. This is a good moment for Wellington. Catholic Emancipation, not the Great Reform Act. The Catholic Emancipation thing is kind of, for me, like that final scene between Jon and Daenerys in Game of Thrones. The last moment where you go, okay, this is good. Sorry?
With the dragons in the throne room.
Yeah. All of that. Okay. That's for me. That's the last moment where you get a kind of a good scene in Game of Thrones. People will probably troll me for saying that, but I don't really care. For me, Catholic Emancipation is a bit like this. It's one of those moments where you go, yes, this is good. I mean, this is speculation, but I wonder if Wellington is kind of motivated by the fact that he's been serving and leading an army that is 1/3 Irish, a large proportion of which would have been Catholics anyway, and so is kind of less inclined to prejudice than some of his contemporaries might have been. But as I said, that's speculation. I've actually seen the draft.
So from the time he spent with them, the Irish, they, like you say, made up between a third and somewhere between like 36 to 20% at any one time. It never drops below 20%. There's not only just the famous regiments like the Connaught Rangers, the Inniskillens, but they flesh out what we could say, the English regiments. And when people want to go out, I was looking at the 12th Light Dragoons, they want to go out and recruit the colonel wants them to recruit Scottish men, make it a Scottish regiment and bring Scottish traditions. And they come back with like 2 or 3 people per recruiting party, go over to Ireland and they're coming back with 20 or 30. And so the regiment suddenly becomes 50% Irish, and they have to stop recruiting from Ireland in case it basically becomes an all-Irish regiment. The Irish were very willing, for various reasons, mostly starvation and poverty, to serve, but it did not affect their motivations then in the wars, and they have exemplary service. And I think this is, I hope, honourably, Wellington's acknowledgement to them and reward to their service.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk about motivations for enlisting in another Sharpshooters, hopefully. And you're absolutely right. A lot of the reason why these people enlist, not just from Ireland, but across the UK, is because of hardship. The times when you have peak recruitments are times when there are economic troubles and people are struggling to put food on the table. They need a meal, and the army provides that, and a kind of a consistent wage. I've actually seen the draft of the Catholic Emancipation Act. It's in the Special Collections Department at Southampton Uni, and Wellington's hand is very, very clear on this. Peel, I think, does the first draft, and then when you look at what Wellington does to it, he's kind of physically crossing out the sections and just rewriting them and going, no, we're not doing that. We're going to put this in instead. Kind of really typical of the man. But I think this is a moment of genuine integrity from the guy. So this is one of those good moments for him.
Yeah, and he's been through a lot. I mean, year after this, when there's the second spate of riots in 1831, Kitty Pakenham dies. And actually, it's during that time that the house is attacked. And that's why the butler fires the blunderbuss on the roof. Kitty's body is lying inside the house, waiting funeral. Wellington's gone back to Stratford Say to help oversee the funerals. And, Wellington's wife has never been very well, and he's overseeing that, but he stands up for what he believes in, right or wrong, which he believes in Catholic emancipation, and he doesn't agree with universal suffrage. We've got MPs today who definitely stand up and say some stuff that we as the public go, pardon, what? I can't believe you hold these outdated beliefs or really radical beliefs, and vice versa. And Wellington's just one of them. He's doing with what I think he's doing what he believes is right. And one of those is Catholic emancipation, which is great. I mean, that's the end of really is Wellington as Prime Minister. He does actually become Prime Minister again, but it's really brief. He's asked much later to become Prime Minister, and he agrees with only one condition. It's until Robert Peel comes back from basically an overseas trip. So it's only a caretaker position for a few months. And that's all he has to serve, even though he's basically begged to be Prime Minister. He goes on. He has really good relations with William IV, who's much forgotten about, and he dines many times at Apsley House, who has a huge expansion. And he becomes basically this great statesman at Apsley, where he can host people from across Europe, all these aristocrats. The who's who really dine there, especially at these Waterloo banquets every year, the 18th of June. He invites so many people, both from the generals and from the monarchy and from ambassadorial roles. And it becomes a seat of power and where deals are made, and it becomes very, very important. Wellington's, he had to stand down as Commander-in-Chief, becomes Commander-in-Chief again, and acts in this great statesman role. And one of his best relationships is he has with Queen Victoria, because you can think of him almost as like a father figure. He remains in the House of Lords. He has all these different roles. He's Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. He's Warden of the Cinque Ports. He has all these different positions, and lots of them are honorary, but some of them actually have, like Warden of the Cinque Ports, have work to do with them. And he has all these different positions that he has to work quite hard. And he's basically becomes from being a father figure to almost like a grandfather figure of British statesmanship. And he builds his very close relationship with Queen Victoria. Until in 1852, I'm going to skip ahead to the end of the story, he passes away down at Walmer Castle. He passes away, he has a stroke. He's pretty elderly now, he was born in 1769. And he has probably actually a series of strokes. And last thing he does is he agrees that he'd like a cup of tea. They move him from bed to his seat. They put the cup of tea by him, and he passes away. I just think it's a great moment to end that he doesn't ever get his cup of tea, but this great British figure, that's what he asked for in his last moments. Queen Victoria is known to be a very strange character by modern standards, but being quite reserved when we think of the Victorians. She breaks down in tears on hearing it, and then when she sees the coffin, she completely collapses. People have to help her up. She can't imagine there being anyone else, and she says he is the most loyal subject to the crown and the greatest Briton who ever lived, and will never see his like again. His funeral is probably the biggest we'll ever see. When we think of the number of people that turn up, somewhere between 600,000 and 1 million people lined the route of Wellington's funeral. It was elongated several times so that it could pass through so much of London, including past Apsley House and through Wellington Arch, so more people could see it until he was laid to rest at St Paul's Cathedral in November 1852. And that's just, I think, we don't do enough on the politics of the time at all. There's some brilliant people out there who do research. Quick shout out to Roy Muir and Jacqueline Reiter and a few others who research the era. But I think it's a fascinating period, and it ties in my day job as well as one of the greatest Britons who ever lived, which brings us back to the beginning of my time with History Hack when I was championing Wellington, the Duke of Boots, and I'll continue to do so.
Yeah, I'm going to rain on your parade just briefly on the Commander-in-Chief thing. I know we're running out of time, so I'll keep it brief. But, I mean, Wellington, as Commander-in-Chief, he didn't really believe in much in the way of reform. And you do have a kind of what they call a Wellington effect when the army goes out to Crimea and takes an absolute kicking because the army has kind of rested on its Waterloo laurels to a large extent, hasn't moved with the times. And Wellington being an overbearing person, which worked very well in the Iberian Peninsula, also meant that when Hill, his predecessor as commander-in-chief, held the role, Hill really just kind of kept deferring to Wellington. So I wouldn't kind of go, yeah, Wellington, greatest commander-in-chief. Apart from what we mentioned already about the Emancipation Act, I kind of feel that it's not a great time for him after Waterloo. And what works for him is that actually he has a period where he steps away from politics and the popularity is able to return. But if I were to sum my position up, it would be spectacular commander, but really shouldn't have been prime minister.
We'll leave it there. Guys, what are you going to tackle next week? Because next month, sorry, I'll do that again. Guys, what are you going to tackle next month? Because you're going to go right back, aren't you? And get stuck into the military, which is your thing. So what can people look forward to?
Yeah, what we thought we'd try to do is we're going to look at things that are both in the Sharpe books and the Sharpe films. We're going to pick up on some interesting elements and we're going to bring the history behind them. We've got a few things to come to you, such as recruitment, motivation of the army, guerrillas, and some of the individual battles as well, but also going into things like Zack specialism, like crime and punishment, and the morale of the army. And we're gonna try to link it through and guide people through Sharpe as the real facts behind it. Because as much as we love Sharpe, we are both huge fans. It is great fiction.
Brilliant. Okay.
When Marcus says guerrillas, he doesn't mean like the apes. He's talking about the Spanish guerrillas, as in guerrilla warfare.
I was going to Monkey World.
Well, it is near the Tank Museum. I know that is your hangout, mate. But no, we're going to keep it Spanish, guerrilla, to use the definition.
I like the idea of gorillas being gorillas.
That'd be great. I mean, there's a film in the making.
Proper Planet of the Apes style. Guys, thank you so much, and join these two again every second Thursday of the month for Sharpshooters. Join us tomorrow when Kit Chapman will be with us. It's always a riot when Kit's around, and I sat down with him to talk all about mad scientists, and he told me some of his favourites in history, and it was Japes, so don't miss it. And then in the evening, join us down the pub because we will be talking all about history's greatest building. And again, I haven't told them what that means. So whether or not they're going to go for an actual physical building that's amazing or a building because something epic happened inside, I can't tell you. Hopefully they'll be imaginative, so don't miss out on that one. Don't forget that we do exist on Patreon as History Hack and on Patreon as well, which is Podbean's own version. Alina and I have had massive fun doing this in 2020, but life's going to change quite a lot next year and we're going to actually have to go and earn a living, etc. If we want to keep up the regularity that we've been bringing you and the kind of guests that we've been bringing you and the workload, then we will need your help. So if you join us on either of those platforms, Marcus is currently working on some benefits for you, so there's going to be incentives for joining on either of those platforms. We're revamping ourselves on both of them, so don't forget to go in. You can do as little as $1 a month, and it all goes towards keeping up History Hack as regular as we've been able to bring it to you this year. We are now on YouTube. We are posting all of our new episodes on there, and we have our own channel, and we are gradually posting all of the back episodes because we have been made aware of the fact that you can only find the last 100 on some platforms. So you can go and listen to your heart's content and laugh at the cartoons and have a great time. So do go over there and subscribe.